get started, the very first thing I want to say about global warming is that a positive future begins when we agree to begin imagining one. And a lot of what we've been seeing in the world is a conversation that focuses on the negative. A lot of dystopian fiction and a lot of dire statistics and dire warnings about species going extinct. Now that's all true, but that's not the pathway to change. So, firstly, I want to express gratitude for being part of this global conversation, because I think it's one of the most important conversations happening on Earth right now. So Randy, thank you for having me here, and thanks to Unity Southeast. What I have to offer, I think, is a unique perspective on the topic, and I hope that it can resonate with you. So, how many here have heard of the law of attraction? Pretty common. I'm expecting most hands to go up. If there's anything to it at all, even for the law of attraction skeptics, I think we have to at least agree that the way we think about things shapes our lives and shapes the way that experiences come into our lives. I want to apply that to global warming. If we keep having all of this dystopian fiction out there, what do we think is going to happen? There is very few positive messages out in the media. And I want to change that. And I want to encourage all of us to start focusing on the positive. And you might say, well, global warming, what's there positive to focus on? I'll give you 5. Greta Thunberg. Who's heard of her? And for those of you that haven't, just briefly, and I'll go into more detail, she is a 16-year-old from Sweden. She's a global activist, and she's on the Asperger's spectrum, and she's one of my role models. And she has really started the global nonviolent protest against global warming. And those words still stick in my brain. There is a global nonviolent protest against global warming. And it started just a year ago. The other great story is also an 18-year-old kid. He's also just a kid. He's 18, Byron Slat, and he's from the Netherlands. And he started the Great Ocean Cleanup Project. And that's an incredible story, too. He started that in 2003, so he's been at this for a while. And just this month, his experimental technology has begun successfully to remove microplastics out of the ocean. It's a huge success. That's 2. Number 3, drawdown. Has anyone heard of the Drawdown Project? So Drawdown is the most comprehensive plan to not only help mitigate, but reverse global warming that's ever been proposed. And it's a global movement. It's a book by Paul Hawken, and it's right here in Kansas City. There are 2 drawdown groups here. I'm currently enrolled in one of their 5-week classes, and it's just phenomenal. It's changing the conversation from what can we possibly do to make less carbon to actually draw down the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, which is the term for the year when there's actually less being put in than there is that we're taking out, sequestering. So it's changing the conversation completely. That's 3. 4 and 5, carbon neutral cities and carbon neutral countries. We're actually beginning to think along these lines, and that's impressive. So a couple carbon neutral cities that you might expect. Now, they're not carbon neutral yet, but they're on this path and they're very committed to it. Portland, Oregon, of course, right? Montpelier, Vermont, which is a capital city where Bernie's from. It's another, of course. But here's one you might not expect. Lancaster, California. It has a Republican mayor. And their premise is they want to be energy independent. So from a variety of angles, however we're looking at this, people are getting on board with this idea that it's important to produce renewable energy, to sequester carbon, and to actually confront this problem. So those are some pretty compelling reasons for hope, if you ask me. And then, this has always been really ironic to me, but after World War II, Germany became one of the most progressive countries in the world. And they are currently very committed to becoming the world's first carbon neutral country. That's impressive. So the point, we're starting to think along different lines, finally. It's been a long time in coming, and I want to focus on that more. That the more solutions that are being proposed and implemented, we're taking plastic out of the ocean right now. Which isn't to say we're still not producing more, that's a problem, but let's focus on the solutions. Let's focus on hope. So I'm going to give you a little anecdote about hope to make it stick in your mind a little more. Who's familiar with the myth of Pandora's box? So Pandora had a box, which was actually a jar. It's a mistranslation to call it a box. And she opened it up, and out flew all the evils in the world. And then she closed it really quickly after she realized what was happening. The only thing left in the box, and this is the thing most people don't know, the part of the myth we're not familiar with, is that what was left in the box was hope. They locked it in the box. I think it's time to take it out. In my opinion, Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who's 16, nominated for Nobel Peace Prize, is one of the people on earth that is taking hope out of the box. And she's doing so in a profound way. So she started in August of 2018 by herself, sitting on the steps of the Swedish parliament with a sign that said, "School strike for climate," all by herself. She did this for weeks. And then she got noticed. And somebody asked her, "Why aren't you in school?" And she said something along the lines of her now famous quote, "Why should we be going to school if you're robbing us of a future?" That was in August 2018. By May of 2019, publicity around her had generated a global day of action where there were 2,200 strikes in 125 countries around the world. School strikes, school-aged kids striking for the future. The movement called Fridays for Future was born. Greta is their unofficial leader, but it really is this organic rising of people, of kids all over the world. In September of this year, just a month ago, there was another global day of action, September 20th. 150 countries participated. And there was a strike right here in Kansas City, right off the plaza. It was really the first time that this movement had any significant momentum in America. We seem to have our heads in the sand, unfortunately, in this country, and that's to put it politely. But if we look at the rest of the world, there is much more action than what we're seeing here now. There's a Canadian company that is sequestering carbon out of the atmosphere into little bottles of what looks like water, and they're creating alternative petroleum products out of the carbon in the air. I'm not a scientist. I have no idea how this technology works, only that there's a lot more solutions like this than we know. Greta was not the first child activist. In 1992, there was Severin, and she was 12 years old. Does anybody remember her? She was speaking in front of the United Nations, and she became known as the girl who silenced the world for 5 minutes. Her message was exactly the same as Greta's, and we heard what she had to say. She made the rounds in the local media, and then she was forgotten. But there would be no Greta if there were no Severin first in 1992. We're laying the groundwork. And what we see finally now is a movement that has sprouted from these seeds that have been laid for decades. We can't always see it immediately, but I want you to imagine that positive future where we notice this movement starting now and fast forward a year from now, a decade from now, and look what could happen when the momentum continues and keeps up. Because the momentum is here now, and it takes all of us in this room to encourage that to happen more. So drawdown. 100 solutions to reverse global warming. Paul Hawkins wrote this book, and it changes the conversation, like I said. It talks about how each of us can get into action in specific ways on 4 levels. Now, often we think our policymakers have to be the ones to make all the change. Let's call our congressmen, let's call our legislators. That's level 4. That's global, national, statewide action. That's level 4. Now, level 3 is community action. That's all of us sitting here in this room. If there's 50 of us, if there's 100 of us, that's level 3. We're coming together to have this conversation. With a brief call, you can possibly get a meeting with your mayor. That's level 3, community action. Level 2 is friends and family. You can talk to your family about what they might do. Just having this conversation more and more. And level 1 is individual action. What can you do when you go home? And we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Back to hope, because I really want to get this idea tattooed in our brains. So we talked about Pandora's box, and I'm going to give you one other metaphor for hope. It's the 7th stage of grief, hope and meaning. So while so many of us are still in the stages of denial, despair, anger in terms of global warming, ignoring it as best we can, not wanting to have the conversation, some of us, like Greta, myself, and Charles Eisenstein, who is one of my role model speakers, he gives meaning to this climate crisis. And he says it's a rite of passage for humanity, that we are right at this wall where all these convergent crises are converging, and we have the opportunity to evolve beyond this, to make a better world for everybody. Now, we're really good at procrastinating, aren't we, as humans? And how many people have heard stories about, folks get into car accidents and suddenly the next day is when they decide to change their life. But it takes that big collision in our lives for that to happen. I won't go into my own personal story with that, but it does. It takes a major cataclysm sometimes in our own lives. For me, it was a concussion. And you come out of that experience with a renewed view on life, a different perspective. But as a society, we cannot afford to hit this iceberg. We have to think ahead more maybe than we already are. Another stage of grief that I want to talk about briefly is the one called bargaining. And at first, I thought, well, when it comes to global warming, there's not much we can bargain about, really. I mean, either it is or it isn't. What are we going to bargain about? But in a way, when you look at so many of the solutions being proposed, bioplastics, for example, we absolutely should be, in the future, in the present, making our plastics out of biodegradable materials. I don't think we can argue with that. But in a way, if we're still living the same lifestyle as we are now, drinking bottled water, even if those bottles are made out of bioplastics, we're still living the same lifestyles, we're still doing business as usual, and we can't. We're bargaining with Mother Earth Can we just continue our lifestyles of mass consumption if only we use bioplastics, please? But at the end of the day, we need to change our lifestyles too, and that's important. Because our addiction to consumerism, to buying plastics, is not making us happy. And so we can have the conversation, will civilization survive if we continue on this path? Well, to me, that argument is almost irrelevant if we're not happy. I want to see a world where humans are happier. We have better relationships with each other. We have more intimate connections. Our communities are deeper. That's the real solution to global warming, changing our lifestyles into being happier people. Maybe there can be a 12-step program for getting over our addictions to consumerism. And I say that half in jest, but I think there's some legitimacy there. And as we know, with addictions, they are overcome when we find real community and connection. Global warming, and we're getting towards the conclusion here, so bear with me. Global warming is a spiritual crisis because we're disrespecting Mother Earth in the same way that we're disrespecting each other and ourselves. When we move more into a state of connectedness, compassion, empathy, the lifestyles that we have that are perpetuating the problem go away. I want to reframe it as a spiritual crisis instead of a political one, or even as an ecological one. Thich Nhat Hanh said that this past century has been one of disconnection. And if we are to survive the next century has to be a spiritual century. And I agree. I think the 2020s have the possibility of being a time of social action very similar to the 1960s. I think that's a real possibility. And we really want to see that be a peaceful movement. We had Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy in the 60s really inspire us to action, to come together. We got to the moon. Now, granted, it took a war to get us there, a big one, but we were inspired to do something as a society, as a people. It doesn't seem like we're doing a whole lot right now as a people. We're just kind of apathetic. Humans have a tremendous capacity to come together in times of crisis. Global warming is the biggest crisis that we've faced globally, and it has the real opportunity and potential to bring us together as a species. Maybe this is saying too much, but solving global warming might be tied to world peace. I think we should at least go down that road and think it's possible. Because we have some great heroes and role models like Nelson Mandela. We need that level of commitment and action in order to solve this crisis. So focusing on the positive instead of all of the dismal statistics about species extinction, but really focusing on all these positives that I just named. It's important. Greta, Byron, Drawdown, carbon neutral cities and countries, so many more. When we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. Anyone know who said that? Some faces in the audience. Glimmer of recognition.
I used it in my service last week.
Did you? It was Wayne Dyer. Yeah, the great inspirational speaker. So maybe this sounds trite, but global warming needs a Wayne Dyer to inspire us to action. It needs a Martin Luther King, a John F. Kennedy. It needs 1,000 people to inspire us into action. And I just want to conclude with one very tangible action step that you can all take when you go home. Consider not buying as much stuff. That, more than anything, can help us begin to limit our addictions to consumerism. Just don't click that buy now button. Notice that it's an addiction we have to immediate gratification. Just notice that when you want to click and buy something. Do I need this frivolous thing? And that might sound like it's not doing too much, but don't discount the little actions that change your mindset, that change society as a whole, getting away from this idea of consumption. So a final call out to Drawdown. This Saturday, October 26th, in the afternoon from 2 to 4:30, there is an introduction to Drawdown. So for those who want to learn more, it's at the Church of the Resurrection in Leawood. And I like Drawdown a lot. I think it's one of the most action-oriented and optimistic movements to really frame global warming in terms of what action can I take. It's very empowering. So I encourage anyone to check that out. So thanks. Thanks for your time today. Thanks for listening. And I hope this perspective was useful for some of you.